Well, good afternoon to everyone here in the room. Welcome to the Rio de Janeiro room here on the beautiful campus of Middlesex University in Dubai, and welcome also to all of those who may be watching online. A very warm welcome to all of you to the expert panel on emerging trends in sustainability reporting, climate governance, and transition planning. My name's Thomas Clark. I'm the General Counsel of the Asian Development Bank, and I'm delighted to open the event. I'm also joined by my esteemed co-moderator, Michael Strauss, General Counsel of EBRD. And it's really, I think, a pleasure, and it says a lot about the atmosphere of cooperation that we need to see among institutions and MDBs, that we have opportunities like today's Climate Law and Governance Day to collaborate amongst our organizations. We have a really diverse and excellent panel here today, comprised of experts from MDBs, regulatory authorities, private sector and academic think tanks, all who work at the real cutting edge of advising and considering issues about climate risk and opportunities and tools to use in this era of climate change. Now, just by way of brief introduction, I think we all know that climate change presents a lot of risks that we've not seen or experienced before, and we're projecting into the future about these. We're at the very early stage of even understanding the physical risks of climate change, but already we're seeing that it's having big impacts on businesses worldwide. Which companies and which assets will be impacted most due to worsening physical impacts of climate disruption will need to be assessed and quantified. And so when you think about it from the present, liability risk has been increasing, and more litigation that we're seeing against businesses, resulting in court judgments that halt or vary operations. In fact, recently, my institution, ADB, held a judicial roundtable with commercial courts in the Asia Pacific. And it's really something that evidenced a growing expectation among those judges, a growing expectation that they will have the need to adjudicate over increasing climate change-related issues that have not featured so prominently in jurisprudence of the past. So there's also a need, of course, to engage in the boardroom on climate change issues with evolving fiduciary duties of care and diligence. In fact, I go so far as to say that now legal opinions are issued in various jurisdictions opining on directors' duties under company or corporate law, and particularly in our region where there hasn't been a lot of big development on this, maybe in decades past, we're seeing a lot of it now. And businesses are getting a big push by investors on climate risk disclosure as well as other sustainability risks. So as you can see, putting all of these factors together, we're really in a transitional period. And the transition to a net zero carbon economy has already been impacting business operations and asset valuations. We're all going to need to look at possibility of changing business models and practices to retool the economy to fit within a low carbon transition. Now, against all of this backdrop, I think we're aware of the physical transition and liability risk that climate change poses. And as businesses are in the process of adapting their operations and governance models to address climate change risk, we also have to look at the financial reporting and standards that go around that. And against this context, there's been a great diversity on how businesses have understood and managed these climate risks. And frankly, a lot of differences between the capacities of large businesses versus SMEs. So in a global movement to enhance and standardize sustainability and climate risk disclosure, we've seen things like the issuance by ISSB of first two standards that have come out, and how this will be implemented in different jurisdictions is going to be really critical. And some of the work, frankly, remains to be seen. And in addition to these global efforts, of course, there are national and local developments that are of interest. For example, in the US, where some of us are from, you have both the federal SEC as well as certain states like California taking the lead, requiring, in the case of California, disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. And it's not confined just to the developed world. I'm happy to say that in Asia Pacific, among our developing member countries, we've seen a lot of focus by DMCs. Fiji, a country with which our law and policy reform team has worked closely with, has adopted a Climate Change Act, which requires a disclosure of climate risk in a very comprehensive way, one of the first among Pacific Island developing states. So I think we can all agree that businesses need tools on how they can best implement the net zero transition, and at the same time, provide for transparency and accountability. And I'm very happy that we have here on this panel a number of people who will try to shed light on this topic and the developments in this space. So with that, I'd like to introduce this session of great learning and turn it over to my esteemed co-moderator, Mike. Mike, over to you.
Tom, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And someone recently described us as partners in crime, and I think that might have actually been you. And if it's just that the crime is not a bad thing in this case, so and for lawyers that matters. No, but I want to thank you very much for all of you for attending, and to our panelists for joining. I'm the general counsel of the EBRD, and I should sort of give a little bit of background about who we are. We're a private sector focused multilateral development bank based in London. We were established in 1991, originally to focus on market-oriented economies in the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. We've expanded that to include Middle East, North Africa, and we're considering in the process of expanding further into sub-Saharan Africa for that work. At our foundation, though, we committed from the outset to development that's environmentally sound and sustainable, and that's something that makes us different from other institutions. That was in our founding mandate. And it's actually very relevant for the regions where we work. If you think about it, the low carbon transition is a real social opportunity in these countries. And one of the things that we're here to do is help countries, many of whom had hydrocarbon economies, transition, and also to help them diversify their economies, providing the finance that's necessary to do that. Indeed, a lot of the economies we work in addition to being dependent on fossil fuels, are themselves vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Our region is really one of the most carbon intensive regions in the world. And that strong reliance on carbon intensive energy can sometimes lead to a sort of a lethargy towards regulatory reform and to reform towards a green economy. One of the things that we're here to do is to help encourage the flow of capital towards that side of the economy to ensure that transition is made in those countries. And there are two key areas where we think are critical in that journey, that green transition for those economies. The first is mobilization of private capital. You won't be surprised to hear me say that because we focus for the most part on the private sector. But we're not alone in saying that. And it is a message that I think you've been hearing quite a lot, probably in other seminars today. We must at all corners and in all moments persistently seek to identify what is holding back investors from sustainable investment, and use our skills, use our knowledge, use you as the future for the students in the room, and our funding to break down those barriers. The second is the systematic reform of economic systems where we operate, and that's where this panel comes in especially appropriately. We will do this by creating the enabling environment that channels not just finance, but also entrepreneurial skill and technology, managerial resources, and frankly, just sheer force of doing what needs to be done and is right to accomplish that goal. In terms of capital, just to give a sense of the size we're talking about here, each MDB, as Tom mentioned, is individually committed to support increased climate finance. And in 2022, MDB finance for climate reached an absolute record high. The share of it that belongs to EBRD in 2022 for low and middle income countries rose to $4.3 billion in 2022, which is up from 3.9 in 2019. In total, EBRD's climate finance for 2022 increased by 35% over that period to reach $6.8 billion. So that's an annual amount that we're committing to the climate fight, and it's increasing over time. And in fact, in some ways, I think MDBs as a group, as a system, are uniquely placed to provide significant technical support and policy dialogue services in this area. That's one of the reasons we work with a range of stakeholders that we do, is to steer financial flows towards low carbon and climate resilient activities in emerging markets. We mainly do this by supporting government clients on regulatory reform, designing innovative financial products with co-investors, and offering technical assistance to private sector clients to make them more climate resilient and help them unlock green finance. Operationally, though, when EBRD started, we developed a set of transition qualities. They focus on, one of them focuses on how we define green. And for that, ultimately, in very recent years, we've developed a green economy transition approach through which we've committed to help build green and resilient economies by doing three things. One, we align our operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And indeed, from the 1st of January, EBRD is 100% fully aligned with the Paris Agreement, which is a great innovation and very important. Second, we enhance our policy engagement for the development of long-term low-carbon strategies and the greening of financial systems, which is a key topic today. And third, we're scaling up investments across a set of priority environmental, climate mitigation, and resilience themes, including energy systems, industrial decarbonization, city infrastructure, sustainable food systems, and green buildings. So I'll leave that introduction on EBRD there, and we'll move straight to our illustrious panel. The panel today brings together really superlative knowledge and technical knowledge in particular on this important subject, and a deep understanding of diverse geographies as well, from the US to the UK, EU, and emerging markets. Our first panelist, to my left, is Victor Mossotti, who is Chief Counsel of the Environment and International Law Practice at the World Bank. In his current role, he manages a team that advises the bank on a wide set of issues touching on international, environmental, and natural resource law issues, as well as on legal aspects of climate change, international waterways, and projects in disputed areas. Welcome to the panel, Victor. Our second panelist to my right, Mark Manning, is a strategic policy advisor for sustainable finance at the UK Financial Conduct Authority. He's responsible for several initiatives at the core of the FCA's ESG strategy. These include work on climate change, climate and sustainability reporting and assurance, transition planning, and sustainable investment labeling and disclosure. Mark is a leading member of the UK Transition Plan Task Force Delivery Group and the ISSB's Jurisdictional Working Group. So welcome to the panel, Mark. Our third panelist, further to my right, is Veselina Haralampieva, who is a senior counsel at EBRD. She's energy and climate change lead in the EBRD's legal department and works closely with the bank's climate strategy delivery team on matters relating to clean energy, climate law and policy, and sustainable governance. Vessi, I know you've initiated a number of client and policy initiatives in the fields of corporate climate governance and sustainability, and we're really looking forward to hearing about that. Next, between them, we have Caroline May, who is the head of sustainability at the law firm of Norton Rose Fulbright. Caroline has been an environmental and health and safety lawyer for over 30 years. She's worked on a number of precedent-making cases, and she's recognized as a leading expert by Legal 500, the Chambers Directory, and the Guide to the World's Leading Environmental Lawyers. We're delighted to have you today, Caroline. And last but definitely not least, we have Lisa Sachs, who is the director of Columbia's Center on Sustainable Investment. Lisa oversees CCSI's robust and interdisciplinary research portfolio and advisory work on the alignment of investment law, investment practice, and investment policy with the Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks very much for joining us, Lisa. So let me jump into questions because we'll be short on time. I'm going to start with you, Victor. We're focusing on Paris Agreement milestones and regulatory frameworks, as well as market standards that have an impact on the Paris alignment. What key milestones has the World Bank accomplished in the journey towards fulfilling climate finance goals and Paris Agreement alignment commitments? And what are some of the upcoming focus areas for the World Bank in climate change and sustainability?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Tom and Mike. And thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you for putting this panel together. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm just going to jump right in. So Michael said a little bit about EBRD. Now I feel like I have to say something about the World Bank. So just really quickly, the World Bank is the oldest multilateral development bank founded in the 1940s. In terms of our interest and support for climate, that has really grown. I would say when I first joined the World Bank in 15 years ago, if you had told me that we would be doing as much as we are doing today, I would have said, I would have been skeptical, right? But what happened in the last 3 years, I think, has been remarkable in terms of a shift. Some call it a paradigm shift. But really, it started with the endorsement of the Climate Change Action Plan, which was endorsed by our Board of Executive Directors in 2021. In the summer of 2021. And what that document did was to set a number of commitments that our board committed us to do, including some very concrete ones, like on climate finance, for example. They said, you're doing a lot, we know you're doing a lot, but you need to do more in climate finance. And so we got a target of doing 35% more in climate financing than we were doing before. Right? Now, if you've been following COP28, you might have heard that target has actually shifted upwards. It's now 45%. What it means is year to year, we're going to be putting out $9 billion plus in climate financing than we were doing before. So it's a pretty significant number. And just to give you a sense of scale, in fiscal year 23, which is what just ended, the World Bank Group, that means also including our private sector finance arm, as well as our political risk guarantee agency, was able to provide about $38 billion worth of climate financing. So it's pretty significant in terms of what is out there. So that's one, climate finance. I think we are doing a lot. We obviously are expected to do a lot more. The second area is on Paris alignment. I think Michael also mentioned that this is an area that, is of particular attention for EBRD, as it is for the other multilateral development banks. At the World Bank, we committed and have now effectively July 1, being fully aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. What does that mean? It basically means that for every single project that we take to our board of executive directors for approval, we have to confirm to the board that that project supports low carbon pathways, that it's in line with the country's commitments towards, dealing with climate change, and that it is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's a pretty high bar. And as you can imagine, it did cause a lot of heartache within the institution about the methodologies for making sure that that is done right in a credible and consistent way. But effective July 1, that is now the order of business as we go forward. So what that means is we are looking at every single project, whether it is in, regular investment project financing, that is, a dollar goes out for a road construction, we have to confirm to the board that is Paris aligned. We put some money behind certain policy reforms, the development policy financing part of it. We also have to commit to the board and confirm to our board that the policy reforms that we would be supporting would support a country's pathway towards low carbon development, right? So that's the second major area that has come out in the last 2 to 3 years. The third area that I'd like to highlight is on diagnostics. One of the things that we pride ourselves about in the World Bank is on knowledge, on learning, and supporting countries to really improve the knowledge base for policy and decision making. And so we rolled out, effective last year, what is called the Country Climate and Development Reports. These are reports that are done for every single country. We've done 38 of them over the last 2 years, covering 43 countries. We look to do a lot more. But basically what those reports do is they analyze and sort of crystallize the pathways for development that countries have set for themselves. We look at nationally determined contributions. We look at, long-term strategies and things like that, and then come up with, the economists in the World Bank do a lot of modeling. So they would map out what this might look like, and then, try to marry the objectives of development with the objectives of climate. So that's the third area. And just one last thing that I'd mention is that, again, something that was announced at COP28, we have come out with what are called, climate resilient debt clauses. What those are contractual provisions that are put into the loan agreements that allow a country essentially to pause debt servicing, essentially to pause the payment of their loan obligations, both principal and interest, for a certain period of time, because they would have suffered from a climate shock, from a natural disaster of some kind, right? So that's that, there's a whole lot that I could say about that. Maybe we'll do that in the Q&A. But that's what I would say. In terms of looking forward, Mike, I think that was the last bit of your question. What do I see coming down the pike? I see a lot more effort on our part and across the board in terms of climate-related reporting and disclosure. We just put out a report for fiscal year 23 on the World Bank's sort of climate-related disclosures. We like to say that it is consistent with the recommendations coming out of the task force. And we look to do a lot more on that, but obviously we are relying on reporting from our member countries. That is not always, spot on. So we have to do some extra work there. We are also looking at coming down the pike, a lot more focus on carbon markets. You would have had a lot about carbon markets and the integrity of carbon assets during COP28. We hope to do a lot more in that space. There's significant commitment in that. That will obviously translate into a lot more work for the lawyers on my team and the lawyers across the board, because every one of those assets to be able to be put to the market is accompanied by a contractual document that sets out expectations, just like you would for any other financial commitment. So I'll stop there and over to you.
Victor, thank you so much. It's always good to get the World Bank's perspective. And you mentioned the task force, so it's a good moment to move over to Mark and ask you, Mark, the UK government has announced that it's planning to establish a mechanism for the formal adoption of the International Sustainability Standards Board's standards. Can you share any insights on how the UK regulatory framework for sustainable finance will develop over the next few years? And how is it complemented by the Transition Plan Task Force's work?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, a great pleasure.
Yeah,
here we go. Great to be here this afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So as Mike said, that I'm joining from the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, which is the UK's securities and conduct regulator. And over the last few years, we've been on quite a journey in terms of building a framework for sustainable finance regulation in the UK. And that has been very much against the backdrop of an expectation set for us by government, which has now become a statutory principle to have regard to the government's commitment to net zero by 2050 when discharging our duties as a regulator. So that have regard operates in a similar way, actually, to what Victor was describing. For every new piece of policy that we that we issue, we need to demonstrate that that we have indeed had regard to the government's net zero commitments, and we've been on a journey to embed consideration of climate and net zero across all of our activities. When a firm comes to us to be authorized to do business, when products are put before us to be authorized, when we are carrying out our supervisory and enforcement activities. And so against that backdrop, we developed an ESG strategy, which was actually launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And we've been working through a number of the commitments in that strategy over the past 2 years. And two key themes of that strategy are transparency and trust. Mike, you mentioned in creating an enabling environment. Well, transparency and trust we very much see as enablers of a market for sustainable finance and for that market to scale with integrity. So we've focused on a few things under those themes, but I'll home in on the transparency piece and where ISSB and the Transition Plan Task Force fit into that. So in terms of ISSB, we have been a very strong advocate for an international corporate reporting standard on sustainability-related matters. We see this as absolutely critical in providing the market with globally consistent, comparable, and reliable information on sustainability-related risks and opportunities to really enable market participants to take sustainability firmly into account in their own financial and capital allocation decisions. We believe that the ISSB has risen to the challenge there, again, launched at COP26 in Glasgow. They've already issued their first standards, and we're on a journey now to see those adopted globally. And for the first time, give us a common global baseline, a common language for companies to tell their sustainability-related stories. We've done two things in the UK around the adoption of the ISSB. First, as co-chair of IOSCO's work stream on sustainability-related reporting, we undertook a very detailed technical assessment of the standards, which led to IOSCO very importantly endorsing those standards for use by securities regulators around the world as the basis for their sustainability-related reporting expectations. A really significant milestone. We've effectively issued a call to action among IOSCO's membership to have regard to those standards to inform their sustainability-related disclosure expectations, be that through adopting, implementing, or otherwise being informed by those standards, recognizing that each country is going to do it in a way that fits appropriately with their legal and regulatory framework. From the UK standpoint, as you mentioned, Mike, the UK government has signalled a direction of travel towards implementing the ISSB for the UK across the economy. The first step there would be to endorse those standards for use in the UK, and then we as the FCA would take implementation steps within our regulatory framework to require disclosure against those standards by listed companies. And the government would then take action through the Companies Act to extend that to UK registered companies more broadly. We've set out already a roadmap to doing that. We've signalled an intention to consult on implementation of UK endorsed standards in 2024. And importantly, we've signalled that we would complement that with disclosure expectations around transition planning. And this is where the Transition Plan Task Force comes into play. The Transition Plan Task Force was launched shortly after COP26 in Glasgow. Within 18 months, moved from concept to reality on a disclosure framework for transition planning. And this disclosure framework really recognizes that successful transition will require fundamental transformation of business and finance and a strategic approach across the economy to set out a plan of action that adopts three principles: ambition, action, and accountability. A clear ambition, translation of that into action, including short-term milestones, and accountability mechanisms both within the company and to stakeholders, shareholders, and other stakeholders across the economy. So the framework was developed in a way to link in with the global reporting landscape to complement the ISSB standards, which already have provisions that relate to transition planning within them. And we have signalled as the FCA that we aim to bring those two pieces of work together as a complementary package to set comprehensive sustainability-related disclosure requirements for our companies. So really important developments in this space. Very happy to expand on the Transition Plan Task Force either later in the panel or in Q&A. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I'm going to move across the channel now to the EU. But I'm actually more interested, Caroline, in how the EU's instruments are affecting emerging markets, specifically the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAMs, and also the Green Deal Industrial Plan. What impact are they having beyond the EU in emerging markets?
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon. And thank you all for turning up. I'm very honoured to be on this panel this afternoon. Having said that, I'm not talking about European law, of course, freshly Brexited the UK. I'm not going to mention too much about that, but the UK sits on the edge now of the market, but is still very much involved in the developments, particularly the implementation, as Mark has identified, of legislative developments. the European Union first adopted the Fit for 55 Green Deal package. The Commission actually adopted it in 2021. It was first proposed in 2019. And this is intended to reduce GHG emissions from the European Union by 55% by 2030. So the Union looked at how that would be achieved, and it set out three main goals. It set out market mechanisms, which were legislative, which included the implementation of the introduction of CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme. The UK has one now called the UK ETS, so not massively different, but that's a regulated emissions trading scheme. Also involved a review of the Renewable Energy Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive. So brought in 13 different legislative proposals to assist with the emission reduction targets and with the measurement of them, and most critically for this session, the reporting of them. So we had market mechanisms, which were principally around the three most carbon intensive sectors: energy, transport, and buildings. So allied to that, therefore, were the carbon finance, the climate finance reporting issues, the adoption of the EU taxonomy and the ISSB standards. We've got two of those at the moment. And so this was translated across into the financial world for the first time, really. I've been practicing environmental law for 30 plus years, as Michael said at the beginning. And initially, for the first 20 of those years, was aimed at operational issues, the heavy polluters, the carbon intensive industries, environmental permitting. For the first time now, with the impact of the EU Green Deal in Europe, we see the financial markets now having to consider the impact of their lending and critically the reporting of their investment policies. And that's where the taxonomy and the ISSB standards are going to be so critical in giving a language that can be compared apples with apples, so that when investors are looking at market mechanisms and investments, they can understand from the taxonomy used what they're comparing and what the impacts are of their financing or their lending. Now, in the UK, since COP in Glasgow, where our Prime Minister announced that TCFD reporting would be mandatory in the UK, we've had that first round of reporting with the FCA as the regulator. And what we've seen from that is larger corporates being able to manage with the flow of data, with the assimilation of their management systems and with their reporting. But for SMEs, that's been much, much more difficult. And that's a real key area moving forward for TCFD and Paris alignment, is helping SMEs who may not have the same resource base as the larger corporates. Turning then to Michael's question, how are all these initiatives affecting the developing world? I was down in Brazil earlier this year. And there's a huge amount of interest and concern about CBAMs and how that's going to affect products coming from Latin America into Europe, having to report embedded carbon in their products, and ultimately having to offset or buy trading credits to cover that carbon coming in, to create the level playing field with goods already being produced in Europe to perhaps a higher standard. There's an awful lot of concern about understanding the legal and regulatory mechanisms, the language that is to be used, the data availability in those supply chains, and then compliance, the attitude of the regulators. And what we're seeing at the moment, huge amount of inquiry about CSRD and CS3D. And when that reporting begins for companies, largely a lot of questions from clients in North America at the moment, again, more sophisticated, larger companies planning ahead for potentially a 2028, 2029 reporting deadline. But again, in developing and emerging economies, less concern at the moment because there's less understanding. And therefore, there's quite a long way to go in education around these impacts and around the impact of the legislation in jurisdictions and economies that perhaps felt that European regulation would not apply to them and would not affect their businesses. What we're now seeing is that global response with legislative drivers in Europe driving behaviours and corporate reporting concerns outside of the market for those wanting access or to sell goods in the market. So a truly global perspective. I think it's early days for CBAM obviously has only just started with the reporting obligations, but it is going to drive real change, which was the whole object of the exercise. I think the challenge will be to help SMEs, will be to help education and understanding, and critically the role of uniform regulation across Europe, which is a common theme from clients who want a level playing field. We've got 27 different jurisdictions, 27 different regulators, and 27 different court systems that respond. That's the big challenge, plus the UK stuck on the end. So that's really how I wanted to respond.
You can't do better than ending with the UK stuck on the end. So, and stuck on the end, on the other end is Veselina. So, Vesi, I mentioned before that EBRD has committed to Paris alignment from the beginning of this year, and but I was wondering if you could help us understand a little bit more about the key milestones that EBRD has accomplished and the journey towards climate finance goals for Paris alignment, and also what are the upcoming. I talked about a little bit about the past of what we've done in EBRD. What are some of the upcoming focus areas for EBRD in climate change and sustainability? I think it's already on. It may already be on, sure. No.
Okay. Thank you, Mike, for the question, and thank you for everyone for showing up and for joining us virtually. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I will answer your question, Mike, but I will also take it from where Caroline left. And I think one of her key points is the huge gap, the awareness gap, the implementation gap in emerging markets and developing economies. And this is, I think, the role that multilateral development banks have been called to play, is to help bridge this gap, to help create opportunities, channel private sector financing into new businesses, green businesses, into innovation that support the climate transition. So as a development bank, we at the EBRD have multiple instruments in order to support this transition. So we have our main mission is to support these emerging markets and regions where we operate to transition not only into low carbon economy, but also an economy that is resilient, that is just, that is fair, that is inclusive. And accordingly, for us, transition has 6 main core elements that interlink. And one is inclusive, green, integrated, competitive, well-governed, of course, and integrated. So for each of our projects at EBRD, the originator, the bankers, are looking to identify those opportunities that would actually, through a very comprehensive internal methodology, will kind of identify the project as leading in one or more of those transition quality. This is quite important because this is, at the core of the EBRD and our operations, and it's how we bring the transition on the ground. You mentioned the Paris alignment, and indeed we are the first MDBs that is fully aligned with the Paris Agreement, with the both mitigation and adaptation goals as of 1st of January this year. That means that each of our investment projects have to be Paris aligned, so they're screened for Paris alignment. So there is a team that works with our clients to take them to the next level, either in terms of project development, but also in engaging with the client and looking at the institutional and corporate foundation, basically the corporate governance, the strategic alignment of the client with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We also screen every project for climate-related risks. So I think also Victor mentioned that it is difficult for the likes of us, for development institutions sometimes, to align with Paris, because we also need to align our clients with Paris. We have to help them on this journey. So what would that mean? I mentioned there is a very comprehensive Paris alignment methodology. In order to identify and to assess a project for Paris alignment, we have also to look at where the project is located, what is the climate ambition, what is the national determined contribution in this country. So in a country that does not have a net zero commitment and certain sector ambition, then it becomes really challenging for us to structure the project. Then we look at the sector, a global sector, low carbon pathways. If it is, the manufacturing or industry or energy, then we want to align big businesses to those more global goals. But so one area of engagement for the bank is working with national authorities to help them develop ambitious yet realistic national climate plans, NDCs. So we have teams working on that. We also work with regulators to create enabling environment for investment, and not only in emerging markets, but last year I advised the Greek ministry on creating a policy and a legal framework for offshore winds in Europe. So you have sector developments, policy and regulation for particular sectors that are new and innovative in our regions. And of course, we also work in different sectors in agribusiness and help create the regulatory framework that would actually encourage investment, that would create this stability for private sector investment and also will encourage innovation. So in addition to this countrywide engagement, of course, we're a private sector bank. Well, 75% of our business is actually directed to the private sector. And this is even more challenging because we have to work with the large corporates. We heard Caroline saying that this is becoming a global agenda. If you want to align, if you want to be the business of the future and to build resilience, you have to align with the global sustainability reporting requirements, with, speak the language that your investors will speak. So we work with large corporates, but in order to support them, we have put in place a corporate climate governance facility. So this is donor-funded technical assistance facility that works with clients to help them identify what are the climate risks and opportunities for their sector, for their assets, for their portfolio, help them create credible transition plans that actually would inform their strategic thinking and their investments. That would also, very importantly, I think it was mentioned, supply chain will actually help them build capacity to work with their supply chains. So we really engage the smaller business through large corporates. I also wanted to mention our financial institutions. So part of our Paris alignment, 40% of the bank's business is with banks, financial institutions. But this is even becoming more challenging. So how can we follow really the proceeds, or if we work with the financial intermediaries, they have a whole portfolios of SMEs. It's quite difficult to follow and assess the Paris alignment of the bank's portfolio. So we have taken a step above the common approach of tracking the use of proceeds in order to assess the counterparty, our clients, in order to look at their corporate governance, at their climate strategies, at their ambition to net zero, and to help them, if they don't have, to establish such public commitments and to put in the capacity to work with the SMEs to take them on the journey. So this is actually a requirement for us going forward in engagement with financial institutions. I also wanted to highlight one final point. I think it's also because Victor mentioned that it's really important that we talk the talk and walk the walk as an institution. And we were the first multilateral development bank that signed up to the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. We have just published our fourth report on TCFD report. But more importantly, we actually are learning by doing. So the functions of the bank that are responsible for climate risk, that are responsible for banking and climate delivery and legal, work together in order to provide this type of advisory to our clients that actually is well tested, and we are credible by providing these advisory services. So looking forward to your question, so we're looking forward to working with national regulators, of course, on introducing the sustainable finance regulations, to contribute through soft measures, to the harmonizations of these measures, and working with IFRS, with ISSB and other bodies to bring in, this knowledge, this awareness to the regions where it's needed most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vessi. And I'm going to now take another trip around the world, a third turn over to the United States, which for a while was a laggard on issues related to Paris alignment, and now things are starting to change. I was wondering, Lisa, if you could help us understand, first of all, where things stand with respect to Paris alignment, climate finance, and sustainability disclosure in the US, and also maybe talk a little bit about the impact of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Great, thank you so much. I might turn the question back to you and see what you see as inspiring in the US, because I am not sure that that's the message that I'm going to bring after these wonderfully inspiring updates from around the world, from the multilaterals and from other states. It really is inspiring and impressive what other governments are doing. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic about the US. I will say I definitely don't represent the US. I don't hold any official position, only maybe as a critic. And it's not even my professional focus. My professional focus is on global, on mobilizing and aligning global finance and investment with sustainable development, perhaps even more with the responsibility of the US, not only within its own borders, but especially to help contribute to transition around the world. Following on the incredibly inspirational stories in the US, we don't even have agreement on the importance of mainstreaming climate and climate commitments throughout our government programs. And that cascades throughout. I'm going to caveat that there's many more interesting things happening at local levels and sometimes in state levels. So there are definitely places for optimism, but they're not in our federal government, I would say. And there's a ton of gridlock, and what that has meant with respect to the topics that we've been talking about. First of all, we just have no coherent framework for the transition in the US, no idea what it's going to look like. I'll get to the IRA in a moment. The closest thing that we have to anything we've talked about is the now stalled proposal for required disclosures by the SEC. They're even further behind. The stalled climate-related disclosures are proposals for broader sustainability reporting, but that's even further behind the climate-related disclosures that are going forward, that are not going forward, except in California, as I think Tom mentioned, that California's adopted them. I'm actually not a cheerleader for California's disclosure rules either, because unlike what's happening in the UK, there's no link, there's no plan, there's no vision for how these disclosures will be used. I find the Transition Task Force really remarkable and important, because the point of having the information is to be able to guide, monitor, and assess actual transition pathways. Without that, the disclosures themselves are not too effective, in my view. So I'm actually not a huge proponent of these disclosure rules in the US, unless and until, certainly not I don't, they shouldn't be celebrated as the end story, as a success, until there's a suggestion for how they're going to be used by the regulatory agencies, by actual requirements for transition, by financing, and so on. And there's none of that right now. I do a lot of work. I watch what's happening in the private financial sector, which is notable in the US because we have so many large financial institutions. There, it's a confusing picture, I would say, because there's a lot of enthusiasm among the financial institutions, a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges, there is a lot of reporting, but it's not yet serious. It's very confused in and of itself, whether the commitments are with respect to managing risk, which is different from actually trying to finance action or to support the transition. And so there's a lot of greenwashing, a lot of confusion, and the level, I think, of activity and commitments and alliances in the financial sector is not visible in real action. Except I just think it's notable that all of the financial institutions in the US that are, first of all, lobbying against any real regulation in the US, including the SEC disclosures, and that are not doing much themselves, are all going to be accountable to the EU regulations and UK regulations, because these are global firms who will have major operations around the world. So I think they're causing a lot of confusion and chaos for themselves rather than helping to design the regulations. They're just going to be subject to these regulations that there's a lot of learning right now in the US trying to figure out what's happening. Let me say a word about the IRA, which is, the only saving grace that the US government isn't fully asleep at the wheel, because they did something, and it's not the program I would have designed because there's no regulation in it. It's just financial incentives, because that's all the US can ever agree on is tax breaks and incentives. But it is, it is an attempt to stimulate some at least part of the transition to renewable energy in the US. And I think some of the evidence has been positive. I think it's also early, but I think we're seeing some investments that arguably would not have been made but for the IRA. It's very American in that it's not at all integrated into global transition planning. It's arguably quite anti-China in its design, which again, I don't agree with, and I think is not only non-global, but also not strategic from the US perspective. And how it relates to other developing countries is also not yet clear. And that's something that matters to me. So I think a lot of the consequences of our IRA are yet to be seen. So with that encouraging note, I will hand it back.
Looks like one side of the globe has a lot more work to do. But this is really, really helpful on round one, and I really appreciate it. And I'm going to move over to we've done a tour du monde in 40 minutes, or probably more than that. But I'm going to turn over now to my co-chair, Tom, who's going to talk a little bit more about the support that businesses need on sustainability reporting, climate governance, and transition planning.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Well, we heard a lot of, I think, encouraging numbers from, our colleagues around the room, from the World Bank, from EBRD. If I were feeling competitive, which of course I never am, I would say, ADB has announced, its $100 billion ambition by 2030. And, we've done about 8 billion in 2022, about 60-40 between adaptation and mitigation. But the reality is none of us can pat ourselves on the back because, the independent expert group and the Triple Agenda report that came out this year said, we don't need 10 billion, we don't need 100 billion, we need $3 trillion annually, okay, to deal with this existential problem. And none of us have that kind of balance sheet. So obviously, and your president, I think Ajay Banga said on Sunday at the Bloomberg Forum that, getting together with private sector banks, figuring out how to de-risk climate investments so that private sector money can come in. That's where the action's going to be. So with that kind of template, I guess, and I'm a big believer in the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So since you were last, I'm going to ask you first, if that's okay, Lisa, in terms of, this mobilizing of private sector capital, what support do you think, that businesses need from MDBs, from national regulators, from standard setting bodies? We've touched a little bit on all of them to effectively, do this double, whammy thing, which is, achieve their Paris Agreement alignment targets and mobilize more private sector, climate finance, especially in emerging markets, and to do it all at scale. So your thoughts?
So much. Thank you. And for the prerogative to go first this time. I'm going to take your questions in a tiny bit reverse order. In terms of what companies need for their transition planning, I hear and I understand the call for standardized reporting. I do, but I think that is because companies are exhausted with the divergent reporting and the confusion around what their stakeholders need. I think standardized reporting is not actually the most effective tool. It's not that I'm against it, but for what companies really need to transition. For that, I think we need a real understanding of credible transition pathways in each sector. Most important in the high emitting sectors where the decarbonization pathway is challenging and will rely on technological innovation and so on. But every sector needs real rigorous transition planning. That's helpful for corporate boards, and it's helpful for the financial sector because we get a lot of questions from financial institutions who don't know how to assess the credibility of their corporate, of their, their finance entities' transition plans. And that's because we don't yet have really rigorous, consistent, here I think would be useful, transition pathways. So that's what I think both regulators and academia and in the financial sector in partnership could do, is to have more coherent transition pathways. I think your first question in order about scaling finance is a passion of mine, because as you said, I'm, and we talked about this, I'm actually quite impressed at what the development banks have done and have managed to do in short order with their balance sheets. But it is crazy what the world is asking the development banks to do with their balance sheets and not being willing to scale that. Again, and I will say that the US is the worst holdout on that, and just trying to squeeze water from rock, I think. I can't think of any more important institution in facilitating real transition around the world than the multilateral development banks, who can do three things of critical importance, to my mind, that are unparalleled and critically important. One is the technical assistance to help countries and regions develop truly rigorous transition plans. And by the way, the energy transition is going to require regional planning, because these new grids are going to have regional components, and that's hard. That's hard legally, it's hard operationally, it's hard financially, and so on. What is the energy sector going to look like? Where's the generation? What's the distribution going to look like? Where do we need public transportation, and so on? Many states need to be really developed with that technical assistance. Development banks can also uniquely couple that technical assistance with public finance and development finance, which in many aspects of the transition necessarily must be development finance. It's not suitable for private finance for many reasons to fund some aspects of the energy transition. And then this third point is really important, which is that the development banks can play, they play a decisive role in scaling private finance in many countries around the world, where for a variety of legitimate and illegitimate reasons, the risk is high or is assessed to be high, and therefore private finance cannot come in at affordable rates. And we need to mobilize the private finance. I don't expect the balance sheets to jump to the 4 trillion, but we need the balance sheets to jump a lot to enable the 4 trillion from the private sector. And that will look like mechanisms to co-finance, and so on. So for all those reasons, I think the development banks are absolutely central.
Thank you. No, that's a really terrific answer. I wish I could comment more on it, but I probably can't. But thank you. Now, Victor, I didn't really mean the first will be last. I just meant the first will be second. Okay, so I'll come to you next. And I mean, but following very much along the same lines, I mean, how can the World Bank support, both the public, but particularly the private sector in implementing these emerging regulations and standards that we're seeing? I mean, they're designed to help them meet the Paris Agreement goals, but where can your institution play a role to really help with that capacity building?
Absolutely. Really great question. And thank you, Lisa. I think you sort of put it, the 3 points you laid out are really music to my ears, and I'm sure to my colleagues as well. Just touching on the first one that you mentioned, which is technical assistance, right? I think that's an area where the World Bank, particularly the sovereign lending arm of it, which is, the International Development Association and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is an area that we're really focused on, right? I mentioned at the outset that we have this new diagnostic tool called the Country Climate and Development Reports. The whole purpose of what those reports are trying to do is to identify those entry points precisely for technical assistance and capacity building. I just came on from a mission in a country in Asia where, there is a proposal for us to finance, actually potentially co-finance with ADB, a major hydropower facility, right? And we went on site, and you talk to the special purpose vehicle, which is the company that is supposed to develop the hydropower facility, from which there will be renewable energy and potentially emissions reduction that could be tradable in the market, right? And you go there and there's 3 people, right? So real challenges in terms of capacity, real challenges in terms of mapping out those transition pathways for, the major sectors like energy, like transport, like urban systems, agriculture. So I think a real effort to understand what the equities are, what is it, what are the trade-offs in terms of how to bring in the private sector, what would they lose, what would they gain, that sort of thing, I think is where we could really add a lot of value. Sticking with that theme for a moment, and I would just say that, you know, the other area that we have seen increasingly over the last 3 years is on more hands-on support to countries for the kind of thing that Vesey was talking about, which is legal and judicial reform support, right? So we don't draft legislation for countries. We sort of advise, we support, understanding, of course, that legislation and everything that goes with it is very much a sovereign function. But I think what has happened, at least in the last 3 years, is I see an increasing number of countries coming to the World Bank with a draft piece of legislation, usually a framework law on climate or a law on carbon markets, and saying, you know, based on your knowledge of what you see in other countries, does this sort of make sense? You know, and then we review and provide comments. We may, you know, contract somebody who's more experienced, an expert, to work with the country and really make sure that best practice is brought to bear on legislative initiatives of that nature. So that's a line of work that I see growing in importance, given sort of all of the developments that are taking place in this space. Thanks.
No, thanks, Victor. That's really terrific. Let me, if I may, just I guess move to Mark, back to you, and I guess following up a little bit on Mike's question from the first round. And as I had mentioned, you know, there's differing degrees of maturity among, you know, both large companies and small companies, and developed markets and developing markets. And so I guess with that in mind, I mean, how do you think emerging markets, or how do you see emerging markets using the TPT framework in the ISSB? And I think, you know, you and Carol have both talked about the need for apples to apples taxonomy and everything, and we all agree. But how do you think that, bearing in mind the varying degrees of maturity at both the corporate and the national levels with respect to climate and sustainable related considerations, that they can use those frameworks?
No, great question. Thank you very much. So I think there's a couple of 3 points here really that I'd probably stress. First of all, in the design of the standards. So both the ISSB and the TPT are at core principles-based frameworks. And with a principles-based framework, there is a bit of flex, if you like, in how one can report against it. Now, obviously, you still want to achieve as much consistency and comparability as possible, but what that does do is give a little bit of room to improve over time incrementally. And we've seen that with TCFD reporting. TCFD reporting, the first go round is perhaps has got a few gaps in it. The second go round, incremental improvement. Third go round, much better. And I think the other thing that the ISSB have been very careful to do, in response to a lot of the feedback that came from the initial consultation of the exposure draft of the standards, is to build some proportionality provisions into the design. So proportionality provisions, for instance, that allow for reporting of qualitative information when quantitative information is not fully available. There's also some transitional reliefs that have been built into the standards. So there's some flex in the way in which the frameworks have been designed, and we tried to carry that across to the TPT as well. The second way to tackle this and ensure that the standards can be rolled out on an international basis across a range of maturities is capacity building. It's been a very, very big focus of the ISSB. We've seen just this week, actually, the ISSB launch a knowledge hub, which is going to house a very important body of resources to help build capabilities. ISSB have partnered with a large number of organizations to roll out capacity building and training and associated programs internationally. There's also been some capacity building undertaken at the regulator level. So I've been involved in a couple of IOSCO's capacity building programs to essentially start to build capabilities among those securities regulators that are going to have a role in implementing these standards. So how to go about the implementation process, how to do that effectively. And I think there's another important capacity building initiative has just been launched here at COP28 is at GFANS around transition planning across emerging market and developing economies. And given that at TPT, we have worked very, very closely with GFANS in the development of the Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework, that capacity building initiative is going to be really important, and we'll certainly want to engage with that. And then I think the final piece is that the ISSB are working on an adoption guide that will set out different pathways for implementation, recognizing that it may take some jurisdictions longer, that there might be some staging posts along the way, pathways towards adoption, rather than anticipating that it will be a one and done in each jurisdiction. So that again will legitimize those jurisdictions that need more time taking that additional time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mark, really, really comprehensive answer. Thanks very much. Let me move, and I apologize, this may be the last question in the interest of time, just because we're moving on, but I would love to come to you, Carolyn, with something that's a little bit shifting gears. You know, for those of you who are here at the beginning session today, Marie Claire said that lawyers have not always been on the side of the angels when it comes to client. Talk about a knife to the heart, you know, for lawyers. But I guess, you know, my question to you is, you know, what is the role of lawyers in supporting businesses in their journey toward Paris alignment and transition planning? And I mean, do you have views on the need for maybe climate conscious approach to legal practice, and hopefully something positive about lawyers, but over to you to round us out.
I'll try my very best to be positive about lawyers. It's a hard gig, I know, but we've talked about the role of law and finance in driving change, but what about the role of lawyers and professional service advisors? And this is something that we've been looking at. I chair the Climate Change Working Group for the Law Society of England and Wales. And a couple of years ago, the Law Society itself was challenged by some of its younger members, and I'm not allowed to say younger anymore, but lawyers starting out in their careers, demanding to know what our professional body were doing about climate change, which led to a lot of scratching of heads in the gilt halls of Chancery Lane. I was called by an old colleague who said, help, frankly, you've been doing this a long time, come and talk to me. So we went and met with the president of our professional body. And from there, the Climate Change Working Group was born, which Bessie sits alongside as an in-house lawyer. We have representatives across the profession. So NGO lawyers, climate change lawyers, campaigning lobby lawyers, commercial lawyers, in-house lawyers from development banks, a broad spectrum. So you can imagine we all got on famously and we agree about everything. No. But what we set out to do was to try and provide some generic guidance for how lawyers should respond to the climate crisis. And this is, we believe, the first professional services guidance of its kind in the world. It's reached Dubai. So I was talking to someone over lunch who'd seen it and read it in one of the more active commercial banks out here. And it's based into two parts. If you go on the website of the Law Society, you'll find it. Talks about the role of lawyers, talks about access to justice, talks about maintaining public confidence in the rule of law. So whether you're on the side of the angels or the devil, the guidance gives you the tools to maintain your professional conduct rules and to act properly and professionally. And there is a confusion about environmental lobbyists and environmental lawyers, and that's something we're keen to correct. When we're at work as lawyers, we are not lobbyists, but we are professional advisors, and everybody has the right to that advice. But you have to be aware of the climate crisis. You can't be a good, competent lawyer and not know about it. And that's what we've been trying to do, is explain to lawyers in private practice, but also in-house, what it means for their organizations, how they can play their part when they don't know enough to understand it, where to look for help. And the Law Society set up a climate hub. And we're talking to lawyers across the Commonwealth and in many different emerging jurisdictions. I was down in Brazil earlier this year, talking to the Brazilian bar, who are very interested in bringing out similar guidance. It's voluntary, not from the audience, it's voluntary guidance at the moment, but we've also been speaking with our regulator, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, who are considering bringing in regulation around lawyers' duties around ESG. So that's in the UK, but it's reached Dubai. I hope it reaches further. It's reached South America. Other professional bodies around the world are looking at it, and I would commend it to all of you to have a look at it and understand how it might influence you in your professional role and those of you who are working in-house.
Carolyn, thank you so much. That I think does redeem us lawyers a little bit and gives us some hope.
Trying.
Thank you very much. Vessi, I have to apologize. The clock is a terrible tyrant. The next panel I'm moderating that you're on, you're going first. I mean, for sure. I owe you one. But with that, I would really like to thank Victor and Lisa, and thank you, Mark and Carolyn and Vessi. Thank you, my co-moderator, Mike, and thank you, audience. It's been terrific, illuminating, I hope. Thanks for a big hand for the panel. Thank you.